Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Impact 211 is a free confidential hotline that people can call for basic needs in southeastern Wisconsin. In addition to helping with food and housing support, the call data provides a snapshot of the region's social safety net. John Hyatt leads the organization, and Bob Waite handles data collection. The two say that the word of the year in 2025 has been uncertainty, as calls for basic needs have jumped over 100% in some areas. And organizations that provide resources for these needs face uncertain financial futures. Lake Effect's Sam Woods is joined by Hyatt and Waite to discuss what they've seen in 2025 and what they expect in 2026.
Take a step back and give a brief synopsis of what Impact is and does. So say I was affected by the flood in August and I need help finding either new clothes or some emergency food, maybe looking for temporary housing. How does Impact help me?
Yeah, so the general theme that runs throughout the organization, we help people talk through their situation or their problem. We consult, we assess, we screen, and so when someone calls, tell us a little bit about what's happening, what have you tried, what are you looking for, and we really trying to find that exact match. So we have thousands of different programs and organizations and services there so that our 211 community resource specialists can look through all of those different resources, whether it's food, whether it's utility payment, health, insurance, anything that somebody might be needing assistance with, and be able to find the right resource and then share that with you and talk about, does this seem like we're getting at what you need? And so when we find that match, then we can share that resource with you. We also go one step further and say, tell us a little bit more about what else is happening. So somebody might say, I lost my job, I have a health bill that I had to pay, and so now we can look for other ways to get kind of at that root cause of that too. So how can we help with resources that might get you back to work, might provide some temporary transportation, all of those kinds of things, because we know food is one thing, there may be other things being impacted too. So we really have that be a kind of a whole person kind of call when somebody calls in looking for help.
Yeah. So to summarize from the perspective of someone coming to you for resources, so if I'm looking for something again, maybe this can be clothing because someone was damaged in a natural disaster, food, housing resources, I call or text Impact or go on the website and kind of explain this is what I'm looking for, this is why I'm looking for it, and then you all provide the
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, we've tried to make access as easy as possible, so 24/7, 365 for people to access it. So all of those different ways, in a phone call, in a text, in a chat, online, or on the app. And we have different languages that people speak, or we can get a translator on there within a few minutes. So again, 24/7, 365. And then when we get you to the resource, there may be special criteria that you need to meet in order to be eligible for that service. And so we can share that with people too, to make sure that you don't go to that resource and then find out, because I don't live in the right zip code, or because I didn't bring along a piece of mail that has my address on it, or a birth certificate for one of my kids, that all of a sudden I've made a trip for no good reason, or I'm not eligible. So again, we make it as easy as possible, comprehensive, but also with everything you need to have it be the exact right fit. Those phone calls typically last 6 or 7 minutes, something like that. And people will say, well, wow, how can you do any kind of work in that little a time? But people are not having a great day when they come to us. And when they're in need, they start out by telling us what it is exactly, and they share some really personal information about their life. and helps us really get right to the point and get people what they need.
So, John, you've been with Impact for a while in a number of different roles, but big picture, as your role as the lead of the organization, if you could describe 2025 in a word, what would that word be?
Yeah, it's the word that a lot of people are using. It's uncertainty, and kind of at every level, at a local level, with local government and funding, with foundations and funding, at a federal level with funding. And so that's the level that I'm working on. When I mentioned before, make sure enough money's coming in so that we can keep doing our work. That's the uncertain part of it. And I used to say that that was a year-to-year proposition, and more recently it's become month-to-month. And so we're finding out that something we thought a funding source would continue through the end of the year all of a sudden won't continue through the end of the year. Or it will continue, but it's at 50% of what it had been. And so there's that uncertainty. And our work depends on relationships with a lot of other organizations who are also trying to work their way through all of that uncertainty. And so, in COVID, when we said we're all in this together, it's feeling like we're all in it together again. And at the community-based organization level, we're sort of the bottom rung of the ladder, and funding and information flow down to us. And so by the time it gets to us, you're all of a sudden in react mode without being able to be as thoughtful and thinking through things. So it's causing us to make adjustments on the fly, which is not impossible. We're used to doing that, but these are things where you're going from a certain level of staffing to be able to serve callers and people in need of help, and all of a sudden you don't have as many folks as you used to. So how do we navigate that?
Yeah. Well, how do you navigate that? When it comes to uncertainty in funding for an organization like Impact, how does that affect your ability to do your work when you're wondering, if the grant we have right now, we're actually going to be able to finish it out?
So we are very efficient in the work that we do. And since even before I started, right, it was always, how do we do this more effectively, but how can we do it more efficiently? And so when I talk about online searches and apps and text messaging, there's a way to do that that's more cost effective. It can be just as efficient and effective as calling and talking to somebody, but trying to have things available. Of course, if somebody's using the app, then they don't have to be calling us. And so it's just a way to shift our financial resources so that we can provide as much assistance to people as possible. It's more expensive, obviously, to staff 24/7, 365. And if we can get people using those other opportunities for finding resources on their own, it's one way of spreading that around. It also forces us to think about and try to make predictions on what next month and what next year will look like. You're familiar with our coordinated entry program, and we'd been central in that for Milwaukee County for the last 13 years, really since it started. And as funding shifted there, and as we tried to raise funds but just couldn't raise enough funds, and the funding from government and other sources started to dry up or go away or never really allowed us to make ends meet, we have to make difficult decisions about programs and programming. And so we decided that at the end of this year would be our last in coordinated entry. And I'm going to be handing that off to another organization in the community to carry that forward in 2026.
So we'll get into data on the calls you've received in 2025 and the types of resources people in the Milwaukee area are looking for in a second. But I want to ask you, John, to help give us some context for the numbers that we're about to talk about. So you spoke a little bit to this earlier, but to ask it directly, what kind of data does 211 collect, and what does this tell us about the state of Milwaukee's social safety net?
So we collect a lot of information from all of the callers, right? But I will also say that it is confidential, and it can even be anonymous, so that while we may ask you your name or your address or your phone number, you don't have to share that information with us. But we do collect, are you male, are you female, what's your age, those kinds of things, where do you live, and what kind of resource are you looking for? And so we're able to produce, based on that information, a really broad scope of the kinds of things that people are looking for, the resources that are available in the community, the resources that are not available, so those gaps in services, and even be able to drill down to things like a particular zip code that may not have enough food resources and those kinds of things. And we get a lot of information because we have nearly 500 calls a day, and in a typical year we'll have 250,000 different referrals that we provide to folks. And so we have these very rich reporting capabilities for all of the stakeholders in the community.
Let's get into what we're seeing this year on the phone. So, Bob, I want to ask you as impacts data guy, what have you seen this year? Are there any notable jumps in calls for particular services or jumps in calls in particular geographic areas? Anything that stands out in the call data we've received this year?
Sure. What we've seen, especially since the flooding event in August, is some really drastic changes in the types of resources people are looking for. And I guess it wouldn't be too surprising that basic needs resources contacts have risen. And in some zip codes, in fact, it's gone up by 50 to 60% in Milwaukee County. That's very unusual to see that kind of an increase in such a short period of time. And overall, throughout southeastern Wisconsin, food resource requests have gone up nearly 60%. And that includes, in Kenosha County, for instance, a 123% increase. In Racine County, an increase of 63%. In Washington County, over 100% increase in requests for food resources. And some of this could be attributed to not only the after effects of the flooding event, but also the uncertainty that's been taking place for those households that are somewhat reliant on the food share program to meet their food needs. And as I think you know, there was a period of time in November where the food share benefit was not provided to those individuals. And during that period, people did get scared, and they probably needed some assurance that they could have food in their home. So they were calling us. They were accessing emergency food resources in the communities where they live, and that contributed to that increase as well. The other thing that we've seen in Milwaukee County in particular since the flooding event is an increase in the number of people looking for clothing and personal and household goods. Just in that period, it's gone up 14%. It doesn't seem like a huge jump, but it's a little bit different than food, where people may call us every single week for a food referral. But to see that kind of a jump in such a short period of time for a real specific type of need that may not necessarily be very common is kind of unusual. So that's what we've seen so far. What we're going to be looking at really into the future is continuing with that uncertainty. And another thing that's been going on, as you all well know, is that it got really cold really early this year. And what that's going to mean is that people are already, working paycheck to paycheck or barely making ends meet are now going to be faced with higher utility bills. So how does that affect a household? That might mean that they are wanting to keep up with their utility bills so they don't have a huge bill to pay in the spring, but that might mean they're going to cut back on buying new clothing. That means they may use their disposable income to pay the utility bill or to pay for other things, meaning they may need to access emergency food resources in the community again. How does that affect children? If they're living in an environment where there is stress, how does that affect their ability to do well in school or to feel okay when they're at school but they're worried about what's going on at home? I think it's very natural and normal to think that's going to impact their thoughts during the daytime. So there is a domino effect with all these things going on, and some of these things don't get resolved overnight. So those are the concerns that we're kind of paying attention to in our communities, and what does that mean in 2026 with continued uncertainty and not really being sure if all those safety net services are going to be adequate to take care of themselves.
So you're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Sam Wood speaking with Bob Waite and John Hyatt of Impact 211. And Bob, you were just speaking about data on calls you've received, and you mentioned that basic needs resources have jumped 50 to 60% in some zip codes in Milwaukee. Food requests up over 100%. People worried about being able to pay utility bills, as well as a kind of domino effect of all of these things happening at once. How have you seen this kind of just seems like uncertainty in the air affect organizations that you refer people to for services when you get a call from someone saying, I need XYZ service?
One thing that we do in the background is maintain information on the agencies and organizations that provide services in the community. It's very important to know that we have 4 people that their full-time job is just to maintain all of that information. We maintain information on food pantries and a lot of these basic needs services almost on a daily or even weekly basis. It's important for us to know, because we built up such a good relationship with many organizations, that they let us know when there's a change. And we're able to make that adjustment in our database right away, so that we're not giving a referral to somebody where they're not going to get help. And that's a very important part of what we do besides the call taking and everything else. And we're starting to hear that from organizations. And food pantries, for instance, may run out of food a little bit earlier in the week or the day, and they let us know, hey, please don't send any more referrals to us. So it's beyond really taking calls, but it's also the relationships that we've built up with organizations in the community. But it is happening. It's that sort of condition may increase, and we're particularly concerned about the cuts to housing resources. HUD has made some pretty drastic changes in how they're distributing money for certain programs related to homelessness, and that's going to have an impact on a lot of different services in the community, especially as it relates to healthcare and behavioral health, but also all those basic needs things. So there's a lot going on that really hasn't hit the road yet, but it's something that we're concerned about and certainly paying very close attention to.
When we can see what we think is going to be happening in 2026 and having a lot of those conversations with our community partners, and it is this uncertainty, and it's like, if this really happens the way that we're thinking it's going to, how are we going to manage to keep these services viable and open and available with just fewer people to try and help folks that need it? And so it's at an organization level, not having enough resources, but then just not having enough of those resources available for people to access in the community as well.
Tell me more about what you're expecting from 2026. Given that uncertainty was the word of 2025, is there anything we can be certain about in 2026?
I think we're certain that 2026 will be harder than 2025, and we're even hearing that 2027 is going to be worse than 2026, and that's at local government level and also at federal level. So we know that Milwaukee County, if you've paid attention to their budgeting, the transit system is in dire financial shape. The behavioral health services had a $12 million deficit in 2026 that they're having to sort of manage for. And so when you're talking about across all of those, that entire county, Milwaukee County budget, those cuts and those reductions have to come from somewhere. And while they try to be thoughtful about how they do that, you're still talking about millions and millions of dollars that have to come somewhere. So we know where some of the hundreds of thousands are coming from Impact, and we know that they're coming from other organizations in the community as well. So we're sort of bracing and trying to prepare for how do we adjust or adapt. I talked before about trying to use technology as one way to find some efficiency and those kinds of things. So, and then a lot of planning and strategizing, and everybody says we got to go out and raise more dollars. Well, I mean, we're always trying to raise more dollars, and everybody's trying to raise more dollars, and there's a limited number of foundations and philanthropy that's available out there too. So, I mean, at some point, the reality is there will be fewer resources, fewer organizations, and it will be harder for people to sort of get along in their day-to-day living.
How does this moment compare to other years in recent memory? Are these challenges new?
I think they are. I think what's different was that when we had things in the past, they were sort of transitional. You would know that they were time limited. We were going to get through a pandemic. We were going to get through financial crisis, those kinds of things. And these feel like shifts at that federal level that are here to stay for at least a while. And so the cuts and the reductions and the shifts are so deep and so drastic that you're trying to think, how can we make our way through this without losing a lot of organizations and a lot of people along the way, and hope that we can make it through. And, I don't want things to get so bad that somebody has to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't working. So I saw information today that there might be some subsidies for farmers on the horizon as a part of a reaction to tariffs and what that has meant for farmers. And so, maybe if it gets to that point with farmers, maybe it'll get to some of this with housing and some of that kind of stuff where they will start to rethink and put some things back in place. So I know that hope isn't a strategy, but we're hopeful that some things can get better.
And I would say the one big shift that we experienced was during the economic downturn that started in 2007 and stretched into 2009, early 2010. And we did see a huge increase in the number of calls because more people were out of work and everything, associated with just needing more resources. But at that time, the philanthropic community stepped in and was able to help organizations because there was increased need. And the community was able to respond because there was a built-in set of resources available to help people out, to help those organizations out. It's not like that now. And like John is saying, we're experiencing some cutbacks in funding, but everybody is, and everybody's approaching the foundations for the same reason we are. This is very different from that scenario, and I think John is accurate in saying, this is very, very different, very unique than we've had in our experience of doing this kind of work.
So this may be a somewhat trite way to end, especially given Bob mentioning that basic needs resources, again, have jumped 50 to 60%. Requests for basic needs have jumped 50 to 60%. In some zip codes in Milwaukee, food requests up over 100%. Utility bill crisis looming. Changes in HUD policy, all these things, right? But do you two see solutions available to these trends, or some reason for hope that 2026 may be a little bit more certain in a positive direction than 2025 has been?
I know that historically the community is pretty resilient and people work together. We have a unique position, as Bob's described, with having relationships with hundreds of these community organizations by virtue of the resource database. And so really just trying to work together with each other to solve this problem, and how can we do it collectively. We start off in Milwaukee with a very rich fabric of basic need resources compared to some other communities. Our housing programs are really pretty good right now. So we got, at least the place that we're in right now is coming from a place of strength. And again, if there's a way that we can all work together, there may be some downsizing of organizations. There may be some organizations that end up partnering with other organizations or merging, those kinds of things that may have to occur for us to get through this.
And I would echo what John just said. When we're going through a crisis in the community, people tend to want to work together to solve problems, and that happens every day in many parts of our community already. And that I think we have very strong, on a local, neighborhood level, we have very strong communities in that way, and hopefully being in a crisis like this again will only continue to strengthen those connections, work across borders, do all the sorts of things that we all need, because everybody's going to be suffering to the same degree across all areas of our community, and hopefully that spirit of working together will continue and only get strengthened.
Well, John, Bob, thank you for joining me on Lake Effect.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
John Hyatt is the president and CEO at Impact, and Bob Waite is the senior account manager. They spoke with Lake Effect's Sam Woods.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.